Thwack, 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 psh. That's the sound of peace. It's the sound of a 3.8% fixed-rate mortgage. It's the sound of escaping a fourth-floor walk-up where your downstairs neighbor was a DJ who only practiced between the hours of 2 and 4 a.m. It was the sound of my brand-new, Wi-Fi-enabled, multi-zone smart sprinkler system, and it was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I stood on my very own patch of Kentucky bluegrass, hands on my hips, a cold lemonade sweating in my hand. This was it, the pinnacle, the suburban dream trademark. My partner Sarah and I had bought the whole starter pack, the 2-car garage, the impossibly green lawn that demanded tribute every Saturday morning, and the grill on the back patio that cost more than my first car. I was 32 years old, and my primary ambition in life had been successfully downgraded from change the world to achieve the perfect crosshatch grill marks on a thick-cut ribeye. And you know what? I was thrilled about it. The cul-de-sac was a perfect little diorama of American life. To my left, the Hendersons were trying to wrangle 2 toddlers into a minivan. Across the street, old Mr. Gable was meticulously trimming his rose bushes. It was quiet, orderly, and aggressively pleasant. No more sirens, no more mystery smells in the hallway, no more passive-aggressive notes about recycling bins. Soaking it all in? Sarah's voice pulled me from my reverie. She stepped onto the lawn, handing me a fresh lemonade. She had that wry smile on her face, the one that said she knew exactly how much I was enjoying my new role as Lord of the Manor. Just appreciating the tranquility, I said, taking a long sip. Listen to that. You hear it? The sprinklers? No, the lack of a guy named Styx dropping a bass track through my floorboards. She laughed, leaning her head on my shoulder. It is nice. Maybe we can finally use those deck chairs for something other than holding laundry. Big plans for those chairs, I agreed solemnly. Big, motionless plans. We stood there for a moment, watching the oscillating streams of water catch the late afternoon sun, creating tiny, fleeting rainbows. It was perfect. A little slice of boring, predictable heaven. This was our sanctuary, our fortress of domesticity. Nothing could possibly ruin it. Except, of course, the twitching of a curtain. I'd noticed it before, the house directly across from ours, a tidy beige colonial with unnervingly symmetrical shrubs. Every day, at random intervals, the pristine white curtain in the front window would pull back just an inch, hang there for a moment, and then snap shut. It was like living across from a very shy, very judgmental cuckoo clock. Our neighbor is watching us again, I murmured to Sarah. Let her watch, Sarah said, unconcerned. Maybe she's lonely, or maybe she's just admiring your impeccable hose-winding technique. She's probably the neighborhood watch, I mused. Every neighborhood has one, right? A designated curtain twitcher, keeping tabs on the civic order. I dismissed it, just as I had the last 10 times I'd seen it. It was a harmless quirk, a funny little feature of our new life. In a world of chaos, a little predictability was a comfort, even if it came in the form of amateur espionage from a beige house. The sprinklers finished their cycle with a final, satisfying psh, and the silence that followed was deep and peaceful. I was home. What could possibly go wrong? I was about to head inside, dreaming of the marinating steaks in the fridge, when the front door of the beige house opened with a decisive click. A figure emerged. It was a woman, probably in her late 50s, with a helmet of blonde hair so perfectly coiffed and sprayed it looked like it could deflect small arms' fire. She wasn't just walking. She was marching. Her gait was unnaturally rigid, a purposeful stride that seemed to crush the very soul of the asphalt beneath her sensible orthopedic shoes, and in her left hand she carried a clipboard. Even from 50 feet away, I knew that clipboard wasn't for anything good. No one carries a clipboard for fun. A clipboard is a tool of bureaucracy, of officialdom, of finding fault. It's a weaponized laminate. She navigated the gentle curve of the cul-de-sac and aimed herself directly at me, her expression a tight, unsmiling mask of civic duty. I felt a primal urge to flee, to run inside and lock the door, but I was frozen. A gazelle caught in the headlights of an oncoming beige-colored SUV of a human. "Excuse me?" she said as she came to a halt precisely at the edge of my property line, as if crossing it might cause her to disintegrate. Her voice was thin and reedy, yet somehow carried the weight of immense disapproval. "Are you the new owner of this residence?" "I am. Leo Maxwell," I said, forcing a neighborly smile. It felt unnatural on my face, like a cheap disguise. "And you are?" "I am Carol Peterson," she announced, as if I should already know. "I have lived on this street for 23 years. I am the acting head of the Neighborhood Beautification and Standards Committee. My internal monologue was already screaming. There is no committee. You are the committee. Your cat is the treasurer." Outwardly, I just nodded. "Pleasure to meet you, Carol. Welcome to the neighborhood, I guess? Or welcome me to it." I chuckled. The sound died in the air between us, utterly unreciprocated. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. Instead, she took a half step to her left and pointed a single accusatory finger at the sidewalk in front of my lawn. "Your sprinkler," she said, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial hush one might use to report a felony. "It's getting the sidewalk wet." I blinked. I looked down at the sidewalk. Then I looked back at her. I must have misheard. Maybe she said a snake was on the sidewalk, or a small sinkhole had opened up. I peered at the concrete, scanning for the aquatic menace she was describing. After a moment of intense scrutiny, I spotted it. A few patches of darker gray concrete, no larger than dinner plates, where the sprinkler's spray had slightly overshot the lawn's edge. They were already shrinking in the warm air, visibly evaporating as we stood there. "Oh," I said, searching for the appropriate response. "Sorry about that. It's a brand new system, you know? Still trying to dial in the spray radius on the corner zone." This, apparently, was the wrong thing to say. "A new system is not an excuse for negligence," Carol snapped, her eyes narrowing. She made a neat little check mark on a sheet of paper on her clipboard. "I'm sure you're aware of Municipal Code 7-14B, which clearly states that all public thoroughfares must be kept free of preventable hazards." "Preventable hazards?" I asked, my smile now completely gone. It's water, Carol. From the sky? It's the same stuff." "It is a slip-and-fall hazard," she retorted, her voice gaining strength. "My Herbert has a sensitive hip. What if an elderly person were to take a tumble? What if a child on a bicycle were to lose traction? The liability would be astronomical. It affects the entire street's insurability, not to mention the degradation of the concrete from persistent, unauthorized moisture." I was in a state of suspended animation, a profound, almost spiritual level of disbelief. Was this really happening? Was I, a grown man who paid taxes and ate his vegetables, being lectured about damp concrete? My brain was short-circuiting. The only thought I could form was, she has a logbook. She is definitely the kind of person who has a logbook for this. Trying to regain control of the situation and my own sanity, I adopted my most placating tone. "You're absolutely right, Carol. My apologies. It's an easy fix. I'll just adjust the sprinkler head a little. Won't happen again." I gave her what I hoped was a reassuring nod, the kind that says, "Our absurd conversation is now concluded." She stared at me for a long, silent moment, her gaze sweeping from the damp spot to the sprinkler head, and finally to my face, as if trying to gauge my sincerity. Very well, she said at last, her tone suggesting she was granting me a temporary reprieve from a much harsher punishment. She made another note on her clipboard. I will be monitoring the situation, she declared. She tapped the clipboard with her pen for emphasis. Tap, tap, dot. Then, comma, with a crisp pivot, she marched back to her beige fortress, leaving me standing alone on my lawn, my lemonade now warm in my hand, my suburban dream feeling slightly soggy. I stumbled inside, my mind reeling. Sarah was at the kitchen counter, scrolling through her phone. You will not believe what just happened, I said, my voice hollow. She looked up, a knowing smirk on her face. Let me guess. You met Carol. She has a clipboard, Sarah. A clipboard and a deep-seated hatred for H2O on public surfaces. I told you not to poke the bear, she said, though her eyes were twinkling with amusement. I didn't poke the bear, I exclaimed, throwing my hands up. The bear came onto my territory and started quoting Phantom City ordinances at me. She's monitoring the situation. What does that even mean? Sarah just shook her head, laughing. Welcome to the suburbs, honey. I walked to the window and looked out at my lawn. The damp patches were almost gone now, erased by the sun. But I knew they weren't truly gone. They were seared into Carol's memory, recorded for posterity on her clipboard of grievances. The war had begun. I just didn't know what kind of war it was going to be yet. Staring at that innocent-looking sprinkler head, a small, dangerous, and deeply satisfying idea began to form in the back of my mind. For the next 48 hours, I tried. I really did. I put on my big boy pants and played the role of the reasonable, accommodating new neighbor. I went out with a screwdriver and spent 20 minutes meticulously adjusting the arc of the offending sprinkler head, turning it inward degree by painful degree until its spray fell a good 6 inches short of the concrete. I stood back, proud of my diplomatic solution. Problem solved. The moisture menace had been contained. The next morning I found a note taped to my front door. It was a single sheet of paper, but it had been laminated. Laminated. As if she expected it to get wet. Mr. Maxwell, it began, in a crisp, soulless Times New Roman font. Persistent sidewalk dampness. Follow-up. This is a formal notification that despite your recent adjustments, a significant level of atmospheric moisture and residual misting was observed in the vicinity of the public walkway during this morning's 6 a.m. sprinkler cycle. The situation remains unsatisfactory. Please rectify accordingly. Sincerely, Carol Peterson. Chair, NSBSC. I stared at the note. Atmospheric moisture? Residual misting? Was she out here with a hygrometer? The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it all was breathtaking. But I was a rational man. I would not be drawn into a petty squabble. So, that evening, I went out and bought a low-flow rotary nozzle designed specifically for edge work. It cost me $12 and my remaining shreds of dignity. I installed it, tested it, and confirmed that not a single rogue molecule of water could possibly escape the confines of my lawn. The next day I didn't get a note. I got something worse. When I left for work, I found a tiny, bright orange safety cone, the kind you see at a child's soccer practice, placed on the sidewalk. It was positioned over the exact spot where the original dampness had occurred. Tucked under it was another laminated note. Hazard zone. Pending resolution. And that was it. That was the moment something inside me snapped. The little retaining wall of reason and maturity that I had so carefully constructed in my mind just crumbled. All day at work, I seethed. I wasn't just angry anymore, I was inspired. That night, I retreated to my sanctuary, the garage. It was my domain, a glorious cathedral of pegboard, power tools, and half-finished projects. I flipped on the harsh fluorescent lights, the buzz filling the silence. Sarah was out with friends, which was for the best. This required focus. This required genius. This required a level of petty, magnificent overkill that she, in her infinite wisdom, would surely try to talk me out of. I grabbed a fistful of dry erase markers and stood before the large whiteboard I used for project planning. I wrote "The Carroll Problem" at the top and underlined it. Twice. My mind raced. The problem wasn't the water. The problem wasn't the sprinkler. The problem was the target. My solutions had been defensive. I needed to go on the offensive. My methods had been analog. I needed to go digital. My pen flew across the whiteboard. A frantic brainstorming session unfolded in a flurry of diagrams and bullet points. Project goals. Deliver a targeted, high-volume aqueous payload. Activation must be automated and based on proximity. Must only target the aggressor. No collateral damage, for example, Mr. Gable, Girl Scouts, Amazon delivery drivers. Must be visually discreet. The element of surprise is critical. Must be, in the strictest sense of the term, technically legal. I started sketching. A simple motion sensor was too crude. It would soak anyone. A pressure plate under the sidewalk was illegal. I needed something smarter. I circled proximity and drew an arrow. PIR sensor array, I wrote. Maybe facial recognition? My heart began to pound with a giddy, maniacal excitement. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was an engineering challenge. By the time Sarah got home, the whiteboard was a chaotic masterpiece of wiring diagrams, flow charts, and mathematical calculations for water pressure and trajectory. I had dubbed my creation Project Hydra. She walked into the garage, took one look at the board, then at my wild-eyed expression, and sighed the deep, weary sigh of someone who knew me all too well. "Oh, Leo, no," she said, her voice a mixture of horror and exhaustion. "It's a targeted hydration system," I announced, gesturing to my magnum opus with a grand sweep of my arm. "It's a smart sprinkler, a very smart sprinkler." "It looks like you're planning to invade Poland," she said, stepping closer to inspect a particularly deranged-looking diagram involving solenoid valves and a Raspberry Pi. "You want to build a water cannon? To spray the neighborhood watch lady? Are you having a breakdown?" "It's a proactive pest deterrent," I argued, my voice full of the unassailable logic of the truly obsessed. "Think about it. It's on my property. It only activates when someone loiters near the edge of the lawn. And it's just water. It's perfectly legal property defense." "This is how people end up on the evening news, Leo," she warned, though I could see a tiny crack in her facade, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "This is insane." "No," I said, a slow, determined grin spreading across my face. "This is an upgrade." I knew she was right. It was completely, certifiably insane. But I also knew I was going to do it. The orange cone had been a declaration of war. Project Hydra was going to be my answer. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed a professional. I needed someone who saw a problem like this not as a legal or ethical dilemma, but as a glorious, unprecedented opportunity for creative mayhem. I needed a contractor. My search for a co-conspirator began where all modern quests for questionable services begin: the Internet. I bypassed the slick corporate plumbing companies with their 5-star Yelp reviews and branded vans. I needed a craftsman, an artisan of anarchy. I dove deep into the murky waters of Craigslist and niche contractor forums, searching for keywords like custom, fabrication, unconventional, and no questions asked. After an hour, I found him. The business was called Gus's Custom Plumbing and Fabrication. The website looked like it had been designed in 1998, a chaotic mess of blinking text and pixelated tool gifs, but the testimonials were pure gold. Gus rerouted my entire gray water system to feed a self-irrigating potato patch in my backyard, a true visionary. Dave B. Needed a high-pressure nozzle to clean out my gutters. Gus built me something that could strip paint off a battleship. A ++ would hire again. Mike T. My HOA said my satellite dish was an eyesore. Gus fabricated a convincing-looking hollow rock to hide it in. The man is an artist. Brenda P. This was my guy. I called the number. A gruff, gravelly voice answered on the second ring. Gus? I took a deep breath. Hi, Gus. My name is Leo. I have a unique irrigation project I was hoping to discuss. 2 days later, a rusty Ford F-150 that looked like it had survived at least 3 separate apocalyptic events rumbled up my driveway. Out stepped Gus. He was a man who seemed to be assembled entirely from beard, denim, and unfiltered confidence. He was probably in his 60s, with a magnificent gray beard that reached his chest, a pair of grease-stained overalls, and the calm, knowing eyes of a man who had seen and fixed it all. I led him to the garage, the war room, and gestured towards the whiteboard. He ambled over, wiping his hands on a red rag he pulled from his back pocket. He squinted at my diagrams, stroking his beard thoughtfully. For a full minute he said nothing, his eyes tracing the flow of water and logic I had laid out. The silence was deafening. I started to feel ridiculous, like a child showing his crayon drawings to a master architect. Finally, he turned to me, his expression unreadable. So let me get this straight, he said, his voice a low rumble. You live in this nice, quiet neighborhood. You got a neighbor, a lady named Carol. And this Carol? She's got a problem with a little bit of water on the sidewalk. That's the gist of it, I confirmed, my voice squeaking slightly. He nodded slowly, turning back to the board. And your solution is to install a series of concealed high-pressure water jets plumbed directly into your main line and controlled by a custom-coded microcomputer, all of which will be triggered by— what did you write here? A proximity and identity verification system. To soak this lady when she steps on the pavement. Essentially, yes, I mumbled, bracing for him to laugh me out of my own garage. Gus was silent for another 10 seconds. He took a deep breath. He let it out slowly. Then, a slow, magnificent grin spread across his face, revealing a constellation of silver fillings. It was the most beautiful smile I had ever seen. "I'm in!" he boomed, clapping a hand on my shoulder that nearly sent me to my knees. "Hot damn, son. This is the best thing I have heard all year." I felt a wave of relief so profound I thought I might cry. "Really? Really?" he scoffed. "Kid, I live for this stuff. This isn't plumbing. This is art. This is justice." "But," he added, pointing a thick, calloused finger at my whiteboard, "we can do better. Your plan is good, but it's amateur hour." He grabbed a red marker and, with the practiced hand of a seasoned general, began to modify my plans. Laser tripwires? Too unreliable. Sunlight, fog, a stray cat can set them off. We're using military-grade passive infrared sensors. They detect body heat, much cleaner. And facial recognition is too tricky. Too many false positives. We'll use a simple logic system. Sensor 1 at the property line. Sensor 2, 5 feet further in. If sensor 1 is tripped, the system arms. If sensor 2 is not tripped within 2 seconds, it means someone is lingering, loitering, monitoring. And then, he drew a large, explosive starburst on the board. Boom! Hydration. Gus wasn't just a contractor. He was my guru, my sensei of spite. He was the Mr. Miyagi to my Karate Kid, if the wax-on, wax-off was replaced with solder this, connect that. He suggested upgrades I couldn't have dreamed of. "We need multiple nozzles for full saturation coverage," he declared. "A pincer movement of water. We'll call it the Splash Zone 3000. And we need psychological warfare. A couple of waterproof LED spotlights wired to flash right before it goes off, Disorient the target. What about sound? I asked, now fully caught up in his creative whirlwind. Gus's eyes lit up. Now you're thinking! A small, weatherproof speaker. We can load any sound file you want onto the Raspberry Pi. A dog bark? An air horn? The possibilities are endless. Our budget was spiraling out of control. My simple revenge fantasy was evolving into a full-blown domestic defense project with a price tag to match. But as Gus and I stood there, two mad scientists cackling over our whiteboard of doom, I knew there was no turning back. I didn't care about the cost. This was no longer about a damp sidewalk. This was about innovation. It was about freedom. It was about making a stand. And it was going to be glorious. The next 2 weeks were a blur of clandestine activity. My cul-de-sac, a theater of quiet suburban normalcy by day, became our covert operations zone by night. Gus's rusty F-150 would rumble to a stop at the curb just after dusk, its headlights cut 100 feet out. He'd emerge from the cab like a specter, carrying toolboxes and mysterious unmarked cardboard boxes. We were a two-man insurgency, fighting a silent war against the tyranny of the clipboard. Our work began under the cover of darkness. We used headlamps with red filters, the kind hunters use to preserve our night vision and minimize suspicion. I felt like a spy, digging narrow trenches in my own flower beds to bury the PVC piping and waterproof electrical conduits. Every time a car turned onto the street, we'd freeze, dropping our tools and trying to look casual, like two grown men who just enjoyed lying in the dirt at 11 p.m. The Hendersons' bedroom light would flick on. A silhouette would appear in the window, staring out at us, no doubt wondering if we were burying a body or installing a private missile defense system. I'd give a feeble, awkward wave. The silhouette would not wave back. The dialogue between Gus and me was a masterclass in absurdly serious technical jargon. "I'm worried about the solenoid valve response time," I'd whisper, holding two wires with a pair of pliers. "We need instantaneous activation. If there's a half-second lag, she could escape the primary saturation zone." "Already thought of that," Gus would grunt, tightening a compression fitting. "I sourced some high-speed actuators from a surplus robotics supplier. They used to be on a factory assembly line that put caps on soda bottles. They can move from closed to fully open in under 1/10 of a second. She won't know what hit her." We debated nozzle apertures for hours, arguing the merits of a wide-angle mist versus a concentrated high-pressure jet. We settled on a 3-nozzle system. 2 wide-angle flankers to ensure maximum soakage, and a central, high-impact primary jet for, as Gus put it, percussive hydration. The nozzles themselves were masterpieces of camouflage, disguised as decorative rocks, and a particularly uninteresting-looking mushroom statue. Operation Hydra was invisible to the naked eye. There were near misses. One night, while testing the PIR sensors, we accidentally triggered the system. I had forgotten to disconnect the main water line. A ferocious jet of water shot out of one of the rock nozzles and blasted Gus square in the chest, sending him stumbling backward into my prize-winning azaleas. After a stunned second of silence, he let out a great, booming laugh, water dripping from his magnificent beard. "Well," he sputtered, "the pressure's good." Sarah, meanwhile, had become an unwilling but resigned observer to our descent into madness. She'd watch from the kitchen window, shaking her head. But her role slowly evolved from one of silent judgment to reluctant quartermaster. She'd bring us out sandwiches and coffee, her expression a perfect blend of pity and exasperation. "You know, Mr. Gable asked me if we were having drainage issues," she said one night, handing me a steaming mug. "I told him you were just really, really passionate about gardening." "We're cultivating a masterpiece," I told her, gesturing at the mess of wires and dirt. "You're cultivating a lawsuit," she sighed. But there was a smile tugging at her lips. She was horrified, yes, but a part of her was also undeniably entertained. The final piece of the puzzle was the control panel. We installed it on the garage wall, a gleaming testament to our obsession. It was a large metal box with a key lock. Inside, a series of toggle switches glowed with little red and green LEDs. There was a master arm-disarm switch, individual controls for each of the 3 nozzles, and a big, beautiful, tempting red button labeled Manual Override. Gus had also, true to his word, included a dial labeled Psychological Warfare Audio. The night we finished, we stood back and admired our work. The lawn was pristine, the trenches filled, the dirt tamped down. To any casual observer, nothing had changed. But we knew the truth. Beneath the placid surface of my suburban paradise, a monster slept. Gus handed me the key to the control panel. "She's all yours, Leo," he said, his voice filled with the pride of a father sending his child off to college. "I uploaded a few audio options for you. Got the classic air horn, a lion's roar, and a clip of me yelling, 'Get off my lawn!' Use them wisely." He gave me a final, bone-crushing pat on the back. "Godspeed, son," he said, his eyes twinkling in the dim garage light. "Give her hell." For 3 days, nothing happened. A tense, unnerving silence settled over the cul-de-sac. I'd armed Project Hydra the moment Gus left, but the monster remained dormant. Carol seemed to be laying low, her curtains remaining stubbornly untwitched. It was a cold war of passive aggression. She was watching. I was waiting. The perfectly dry sidewalk between our houses was our Berlin Wall. I realized she wouldn't make the first move without provocation. She needed a reason, an infraction to document. So, on the 4th day, I laid the bait. That afternoon, I went outside and deliberately, and very obviously, turned on my original, harmless front lawn sprinklers, the ones with the carefully adjusted non-sidewalk offending spray pattern. Then, with an exaggerated show of carelessness, I accidentally kicked the corner sprinkler head. A gentle, pathetic little mist began to drift over the edge of the lawn, depositing a faint, almost apologetic sheen of moisture on the concrete. It was the most pathetic slip-and-fall hazard imaginable. It was perfect. I retreated inside, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm against my ribs. I took up a strategic position at our living room window, peering through the blinds like a sniper in his nest. Sarah, sensing the imminent drama, abandoned her laptop and joined me, half hiding behind a large potted fern. "You're a terrible person," she whispered, her voice giddy with anticipation. "I'm a proactive problem solver," I corrected her. We didn't have to wait long. Like a shark smelling a single drop of blood in the ocean, the front door of the beige house creaked open. Carol emerged. She was armed for battle. The clipboard was in one hand, and in the other, she held her smartphone, already recording. Her little white dog, a yapping furball I privately called Prince Fluffybutt, trotted ahead of her, blissfully unaware of the aquatic doom that awaited. She marched toward the scene of the crime, her eyes locked on the glistening concrete. "This is it," I breathed, my hand hovering over the manual override button on the remote I'd synced with the system. But I wouldn't need it. I had faith in Gus's engineering. She stopped, right in the center of the kill zone. She raised her phone, panning slowly to capture the evidence of my gross negligence. Prince Fluffybutt, meanwhile, lifted his leg on the edge of my lawn. The universe has a funny sense of timing. That was the moment the PIR sensor, detecting a stationary warm body, sent its silent, electronic signal to the brain in my garage. Time seemed to slow down. I saw it all with a crystal clarity. 2 things happened at once. First, 2 brilliant white LED spotlights hidden in the mulch flashed on, bathing Carol in a harsh, interrogative glare. Second, the weatherproof speaker crackled to life. Gus had outdone himself. He hadn't used any of the sounds we'd discussed. Instead, the speaker blared the opening orchestral blast of Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries. Carol froze, blinded and confused, her phone lowering slightly. Prince Fluffybutt yelped, startled by the sudden sound and light. And then, from 3 separate, camouflaged locations, Project Hydra awoke. It wasn't a spray. It wasn't a mist. It was a coordinated, tactical strike of pure, unadulterated water. 3 thick, powerful jets erupted from the ground and converged on her with the force of a fire hose. The central jet slammed into her torso, the 2 flankers hitting her from the sides in a perfect pincer movement. The effect was instantaneous and glorious. A great whoomph of water sent her stumbling backward. The clipboard flew from her grasp, its laminated pages scattering like wounded birds. Her phone went spinning through the air. The perfectly sculpted helmet of hair collapsed in a single, tragic moment, slumping down over her face like a wet mop. She let out a shriek that was a perfect symphony of shock, rage, and profound indignation. It was the shriek of a woman who had never, in her 23 years of monitoring the neighborhood, been so thoroughly and unexpectedly hydrated. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. It wasn't a chuckle. It was a wild, cackling, slightly unhinged roar of pure triumph. All the frustration, all the pettiness, all the laminated notes. It all came pouring out of me in that laugh. Sarah just stared, her mouth wide open, her hand covering it in shock. She looked at the unfolding chaos outside, then back at me, my face contorted in manic glee. Outside, Carol was on her hands and knees, sputtering and soaked to the bone. Prince Fluffybutt was barking hysterically from a safe distance. The Ride of the Valkyries played on, a triumphant score to the suburban apocalypse I had just unleashed. And then, cutting through the music, another sound reached my ears. Faint at first, but growing louder. It was a siren. My laughter died in my throat. Oh, right, consequences. The flashing red and blue lights painted the cul-de-sac in frantic, strobing colors, turning our tranquil suburban street into the set of a primetime crime drama. By the time the police cruiser rolled to a stop, Carol had retreated to her own lawn, where her husband, a bewildered-looking man I now knew as Herbert, had wrapped her in what appeared to be a space blanket. She looked like a victim of a maritime disaster, pointing a trembling, waterlogged finger toward my house while giving a hysterical statement to the 2 officers. I watched them approach my front door. My adrenaline-fueled euphoria had evaporated, replaced by the cold, clammy dread of having to explain a home, made water cannon system to law enforcement. Sarah was pacing behind me, whispering, "I'm calling a lawyer. We need a lawyer. Leo, this is not funny anymore." The doorbell rang. I took a deep breath, composed my face into an expression of mild, innocent confusion, and opened the door. The 2 officers were a classic pairing. The one on the left, Officer Miller, was older, with a thick mustache, and the weary, 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen every possible flavor of human stupidity and was profoundly tired of all of them. The one on the right, Officer Davis, was younger, sharp-eyed, and looked like he actually kept up with technology. This was going to be a tough audience. "Good evening, sir," Officer Miller said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Are you Leo Maxwell?" "I am," I said politely. "Is there a problem, officers?" Miller gestured with his thumb over his shoulder toward the glittering spectacle on Carol's lawn. "Son, your neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, is claiming you assaulted her with your sprinklers." He said the last 2 words with a tone of deep professional pain, as if it physically hurt him to form the sentence. I widened my eyes in my best performance of shocked innocence. "Assaulted her? With my sprinklers? Officer, that's impossible. I was just inside with my partner. I do have a new irrigation system I just installed. Maybe it malfunctioned?" "She says it has spotlights and played classical music," Officer Davis chimed in. A flicker of something, curiosity, amusement, in his eyes? I feigned a thoughtful frown. Oh, that? Yes, that's the advanced pest deterrent feature, I said, the lie sliding out with surprising ease. It's a humane way to scare off raccoons, deer, pests. A flash of light, a loud noise. It's designed to be startling. I guess a person could wander into the sensor range. It's very high-tech. Maybe the sensitivity is calibrated too high. Officer Miller was not buying it. Not one bit. His weary eyes stared into my soul. Sir, Mrs. Peterson is claiming the water jets were powerful enough to knock her down. She's also claiming the system specifically targeted her. And her little dog. That's awful. I'll have to call the manufacturer, I said, shaking my head in dismay. It's a new eco-friendly system from, Aqua Defense, a startup out of Silicon Valley. It uses AI-driven water conservation technology. It's very cutting edge. I was piling lie upon lie, building a glorious, nonsensical fortress of fabrication. Davis was looking more intrigued, but Miller's expression had hardened. Sir, we need to see this system, Miller stated. It wasn't a request. I led them around the side of the house to the garage. I knew this was the moment of truth. I unlocked the control panel, revealing the glowing switches and dials. My heart hammered. Officer Davis's eyes lit up immediately. Whoa, is that a Raspberry Pi 4 controller? And are those custom-wired solid-state relays? Nice setup. He leaned in, genuinely impressed. Did you build this yourself? I, had a contractor help with the installation, I said, trying not to look at Miller, who was staring at the label Psychological Warfare Audio with an expression of profound disbelief. Son, Miller said, his voice dangerously quiet. This is not a pest deterrent system. This is a custom-built, neighbor-soaking machine. It's on my property, officer, I countered, falling back on my last line of defense. The sensors, the nozzles, everything. It's just water from my own spigot. It's no different from me standing here with a garden hose, is it? I'm allowed to water my lawn. The two officers exchanged a look. I had them. I had found the beautiful, murky, legal gray area. It wasn't assault, because I hadn't touched her. It wasn't property damage, because it was just water. It was malicious. It was childish. It was profoundly unneighborly. But it wasn't, technically, a crime they could easily define. Officer Davis was trying, and failing, to hide a smirk. He turned away, pretending to inspect a wrench on my pegboard. Officer Miller, however, was not amused. He stepped closer to me, his face grim. Listen to me very carefully, Mr. Maxwell, he said, his voice low. You are walking a very, very fine line here. You're a clever guy, and you've built yourself a clever little toy. We can't arrest you for this today, but I promise you, if Mrs. Peterson so much as slips on a wet leaf anywhere near this sidewalk, we will find a way to make this a problem for you, a very expensive problem. Do you understand me? Crystal clear, officer, I said. Shut it down, he ordered. Deactivate the entire system permanently. Of course, I lied, flipping the master arm switch to disarm with a theatrical click. They gave me one last, long, hard look and then left, walking back to their cruiser to deliver the deeply unsatisfying news to Carol. I watched them go, a giddy sense of victory bubbling in my chest. I had faced the law and walked away. I had won. But as I watched Carol, still wrapped in her shiny blanket, glaring at my house with eyes that promised a biblical reckoning, I knew this was far from over. I had won the battle. The war, however, had just escalated into a whole new theater. The great soaking of Carol Peterson, as it came to be known, sent ripples through the placid pond of our cul-de-sac. The immediate aftermath was stark. 2 days later, a "For Sale" sign sprouted on the Hendersons' lawn like a nervous mushroom after a storm. I couldn't entirely blame them. Living between a woman who legislates sidewalk moisture and a man who enforces his property lines with tactical water ordnance probably wasn't the peaceful suburban experience they'd signed up for. But the reaction wasn't entirely negative. The day after the incident, my doorbell rang. It was old Mr. Gable from next door. He stood on my porch, a beatific smile on his face, holding a plate covered in foil. "I heard about the sprinkler malfunction," he said, his eyes twinkling. He handed me the plate. "My wife, Martha, baked you some oatmeal raisin cookies. She says you're a hero." He leaned in conspiratorially. "That woman once tried to file a formal complaint because one of my roses grew through the fence into her yard. Said it was horticultural trespassing." He patted my arm, gave me a slow, deliberate wink, and shuffled back to his prize-winning roses. The battle lines were drawn online, too. Our neighborhood's private social media page, usually a benign forum for lost cats and recommendations for roofers, exploded into a digital civil war. A post by Carol titled "Vicious Attack by Unhinged Neighbor" was met with a surprising wave of dissent. The #Team Leo faction emerged, filled with residents who had their own stories of Carol's reign of petty terror. My malfunctioning pest deterrent system became the stuff of local legend. I was simultaneously a pariah and a folk hero. Carol, however, was not a woman to be so easily defeated. After her public humiliation and the failure of law enforcement to drag me away in chains, she shifted her strategy from direct confrontation to psychological warfare. A few days later, I saw a van from a home security company parked in her driveway. By evening, 2 new, gleaming security cameras were mounted under her eaves, both aimed squarely at my house. She had abandoned the clipboard in favor of 24/7 surveillance. Now, whenever I went outside to grill or get the mail, I could feel her eyes on me, not from the window, but through the cold, unblinking lens of a camera. She would stand in her front yard, phone in hand, pretending to text while very obviously recording me. It was a silent, unending campaign of intimidation. But it didn't matter. The cannons remained, disarmed for now, but always ready. Their presence was a constant, unspoken threat. We had entered a new phase of our relationship, a state of mutually assured destruction. She wouldn't file another complaint, and I wouldn't activate the deluge. The sidewalk in front of my house, once a hotly contested no-man's land, was now the most respected and certainly the driest piece of concrete in the entire state. A strange, tense peace had fallen over the cul-de-sac. 3 months later, the "For Sale" sign on the Hendersons' lawn had a "Sold" banner slapped across it. Summer had ripened into early fall, and the air was crisp and cool. I was on my back deck, standing before the gentle glow of my grill, a pair of tongs in my hand. On the grate, 2 thick-cut ribeyes sizzled, their aroma filling the evening air. The back door slid open and Sarah stepped out, carrying 2 cold beers. She handed one to me and leaned against the railing, looking out at the quiet backyard. The tension of the last few months had finally begun to fade, replaced by the comfortable rhythm of our new, albeit bizarre, normal. "You know," she said, taking a sip of her beer, "the new neighbors seem nice. I brought them some of Martha Gable's cookies as a welcome gift." "That was nice of you," I said, flipping the stakes. The crosshatch pattern was perfect. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the sizzle of the grill and the distant sound of children playing down the street. It was peaceful. It was the exact scene I had pictured in my head all those months ago when we first bought the house. It had just taken a slightly more complicated path to get here. Sarah looked at me, a thoughtful, amused expression on her face. "Was it worth it?" she asked quietly. "All of it? The insane contractor, the thousands of dollars, the police report, being known across 3 suburbs as the water cannon psycho? I looked at the perfectly cooked steak, then out toward the front of the house, where I knew a bone-dry sidewalk lay under the streetlights. I thought of the laminated notes, the little orange cone, and the glorious, operatic moment of Carol's total and complete saturation. I thought about the quiet satisfaction of Mr. Gable's wink and the taste of his wife's victory cookies. I took a bite of the steak. It was perfect, a flawless medium rare. "Yeah," I said, chewing thoughtfully. "Yeah, I think it was." As if on cue, a flicker of movement from the front of the house caught my eye. Through the gap between our homes, I could see the porch light of the beige house click on. Carol was taking out her recycling bin. She moved with her usual rigid purpose, but as she walked back toward her door, her head turned and her gaze met mine for a brief, electric second across the manicured lawns. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just a narrowing of her eyes, a silent testament to our ongoing, unspoken truce. She gave the sidewalk a wide berth as she went back inside. I gave a slight, satisfied nod to no one in particular and took a long sip of my beer. I had finally achieved my suburban dream. It just required a little bit of hydraulic engineering, a dash of psychological warfare, and the ever-present threat of total saturation. I had my peace and quiet. I just had to get it a little bit wet first.